The folding chairs were still stacked against the wall when I realized my daughter hadn't planned to use them. I was standing in the doorway of the community room at Grace Lutheran Church in Terre Haute, Indiana, holding a pan of her favorite lemon bars, still warm from the oven. My son-in-law Richard had called 3 days earlier to say they were hosting a small gathering. A celebration, he called it. Evelyn had just made partner at her firm, 22 years of 80-hour weeks, and she'd finally reached the top of the ladder she'd been climbing since law school. I was proud of her, genuinely proud. So I baked. I drove 40 minutes. I walked in wearing the blue cardigan she gave me 2 Christmases ago. There were maybe 15 people in the room, colleagues from the firm. A judge I didn't recognize. 2 women I'd never seen before, both holding wine glasses, both laughing at something Richard had just said. Nobody was sitting. Nobody was eating. Nobody had touched the cheese platter on the side table. Evelyn saw me from across the room. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not happiness. More like the look you get when you realize you forgot to cancel something you no longer need. She crossed the room, kissed my cheek. "Dad, you didn't have to bring anything. Lemon bars," I said. "Your favorite." She smiled the way people smile at well-meaning strangers. "I'll put them in the kitchen." She took the pan and disappeared. I stood there holding nothing. In a room full of people I didn't know. In a cardigan my daughter had given me, waiting for someone to tell me where to stand. Nobody did. I found a chair near the window and sat down. For the next 90 minutes, I watched my daughter work the room. She was brilliant at it. Confident, polished, exactly the kind of woman who belongs in a space like that. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered everyone's names. She touched people's arms when she made a point. I watched her do all of this and felt 2 things at the same time. Deep, genuine pride, and something else I didn't have a name for yet. At one point, a man in a gray suit walked over to introduce himself. Turned out he was a senior partner at a firm across town. He shook my hand and asked how I knew Evelyn. Before I could answer, she materialized beside me. "This is my father," she said. Then almost immediately she added, "He used to run a small landscaping business." Used to. Small. The man nodded politely and moved on. I stayed another 20 minutes. Then I told Evelyn I needed to get home before it got too dark to drive. She hugged me at the door. She said she'd call soon. She never mentioned the lemon bars again. On the drive home, I passed the county fairgrounds where I used to take her every summer when she was a kid. The lights were off. The parking lot was empty. I kept driving. There's a question that follows a man home on nights like that. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits quietly in the passenger seat while you watch the headlights eat up the yellow dividing lines. The question is simple. After everything, is this what I am to you? I was 66 years old, retired, healthy enough, quiet enough. And that night, sitting in my driveway with the engine still running, I started to understand that my daughter had built a picture of me in her mind. And in that picture, I was a background figure. Harmless, irrelevant. A man who used to do something small. She had no idea who she was actually looking at. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Frank Delaney. I grew up in Evansville, Indiana, the youngest of 4 boys, in a house where money was something you worried about, not something you planned with. My father drove a delivery truck for 30 years. My mother cleaned houses on the other side of town. Nobody in my family had ever owned anything worth mentioning. We were proud people. Honest people. But we weren't the kind of people who accumulated things. I graduated high school in 1977 and started working for a landscaping crew the following Monday. Not because I had a plan, because a man named Gerald Hutchins offered me $11 an hour and I needed to eat. Gerald was 60 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and the smartest businessman I have ever known. He could look at a piece of land and see what it would become. Not what it was, what it would become. I spent 8 years learning everything he knew. When Gerald retired in 1985, he sold me his equipment for less than it was worth and told me I'd better not waste it. I didn't. What started as a 2-man operation out of a rented garage in Terre Haute grew into something I never anticipated. We didn't just cut grass, we designed, we planned. We managed large commercial properties, municipal contracts, eventually entire residential communities. By the mid-90s, Delaney Grounds Management had contracts with 4 hospital systems, 2 university campuses, and more apartment complexes than I could count. We had 93 employees at our peak. Payroll ran over $4 million a year. I was never flashy about it. This was partly stubbornness, partly genuine preference. I drove the same pickup truck for 11 years. We lived in the same four-bedroom house in a regular neighborhood where my daughter grew up riding her bike to school. I wore work boots to most meetings. I shook hands with the crews every morning. That was just who I was. My wife, Carol, understood that about me completely. She'd grown up the same way I had the daughter of a machinist from Bloomington, and neither of us had much patience for showing off. We had a good life. Not a showy life. A good one. Carol passed in 2009, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't say much more about that because there aren't enough words, and the ones that exist don't come close to accurate. What I will say is this. After she was gone, I made some decisions. I sold the operating company in 2012 to a regional property management group out of Indianapolis. Kept a minority stake in the holding company. Kept a few commercial properties I'd bought over the years in an LLC. Worked with a financial advisor I'd trusted for a long time to restructure everything into a family trust. All of it was quiet, intentional, tidy. The kind of thing that doesn't make headlines and isn't supposed to. Evelyn was in law school at the time. She knew I'd sold the business. She assumed I'd done fine. She never asked the specifics. Lawyers learn early to pay attention to details, but sometimes the details closest to you are the easiest to overlook. By the time she made partner, she genuinely believed her father was a retired landscaper living on savings and Social Security. She wasn't being cruel. She just wasn't paying attention. And I hadn't corrected her. That was on me. Here's why I didn't. About 2 years after I sold the company, Evelyn called me from Chicago. She'd moved there for a clerkship and never quite moved back. We were talking about nothing in particular, and she said something that stayed with me. She was telling me about a partner at her firm, some man named Douglas, old money, the kind of comfortable that gets handed down through generations. You just carry yourself differently, she said about him. When you've always had security, it shows. I let the comment sit. Then I asked her, does it matter where it came from? She laughed a little. Dad, of course it does. People can tell. Tad, that was the moment I understood something. My daughter had assigned me a place in the world, and in her mind that place was fixed, earned but limited, decent but modest. She respected what she thought I was. She just didn't think it was very much. I didn't argue. I went quiet. And in the years that followed, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I watched her husband Richard talk about investment portfolios at Thanksgiving like I wasn't in the room. I watched her redirect conversations at family dinners when they got too close to topics she assumed I wouldn't understand. I watched her, once, explain compound interest to me slowly and carefully, as if she were teaching a child. She meant well. That was the part that stuck in my throat. She genuinely meant well. The clearest moment came about 8 months before that celebration party, on a Sunday afternoon in early April. I'd driven up to Chicago to help her sort through some boxes she'd pulled out of storage. Things from her mother's side, photographs, old documents, things Carol had kept for reasons neither of us fully understood. We were sitting on the floor of her guest room, and she pulled out a folder of old paperwork from the early days of the business. She glanced at it briefly. Didn't you have like a dozen employees at the most? I looked at the folder. At the start, she nodded and set it aside. A dozen employees at the most. After everything Gerald taught me, after 11-hour days for 30 years. After payroll, contracts, hospital systems, university campuses. After 93 families who drew a salary because Delaney grounds management kept growing, a dozen employees at the most. I didn't correct her. I helped her finish the boxes, drove home, and sat in my kitchen until midnight thinking about Carol, who would have fixed this whole thing with a single conversation and probably a Dutch apple pie. I called my attorney the following week. His name was Dennis Cho, and I had trusted him since 1998. I told him I wanted to make sure my estate documents were in order, which was true, and also that I wanted to think carefully about what I was building toward, which was the more honest version. We spent 2 months going through everything: the trust, the LLC properties, the retained stake in the holding company. By the time we finished, the documentation was clean and complete and reflected exactly what I had built over a lifetime. Dennis asked me if I wanted to talk to Evelyn about any of it. I told him not yet. He said, Frank, Sooner or later, something is going to force the conversation. I already knew that. I just didn't know it was going to happen in a hotel ballroom in front of 400 people. The occasion was the Wabash Valley Business Foundation Gala. Annual event, black tie, raises money for regional economic development. I'd been on the foundation board for 11 years, which almost nobody in my current life knew because it had never come up and I'd never brought it up. That year, the foundation was announcing the endowment of a new workforce training center, skilled trades, specifically electrical, welding, HVAC, plumbing, the kind of training that kept the region actually running. The lead donor, whose name would go on the building, had contributed just over $2 million. I was that donor. I hadn't told Evelyn I was attending. She'd been invited by her firm, which was a corporate sponsor. When Richard mentioned it 2 weeks earlier over the phone, I said I might stop by. He said, and I am quoting him exactly, "It's a pretty upscale crowd, Frank. Probably not your usual scene." I told him I'd think about it. The night of the gala, I put on the suit I'd bought in 2019 for Carol's memorial service. The good one, charcoal gray. The one that still fit. I drove to the hotel. I checked in with the foundation coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had known me for years and greeted me with genuine warmth. I found my seat at the board table near the front. I didn't look for Evelyn and Richard. I figured I'd find them afterward. The program began around 7:30. Speeches, presentations, acknowledgments, the usual architecture of these events. I sat quietly, watched the room, drank water, thought about Gerald Hutchins, who would have laughed himself sideways at the sight of me in a charcoal suit at a black tie gala. Then the foundation chair, a woman named Patricia Ellison, took the podium to announce the Workforce Center. I didn't see Evelyn until that moment. She and Richard were seated 3 tables to my right. She was in a burgundy dress. He was in a navy suit. They were talking quietly, not watching the podium. She looked comfortable, at home in the room, doing exactly what she did at every event like this, which was being impressive without trying too hard. Patricia began to speak. She talked about the trades shortage in the region. She talked about what the center would mean for young workers who weren't headed to 4-year universities. She talked about a donor who had deep roots in this community, who had built something lasting here, who had never once sought recognition for any of it. Then she said my name. I stood. The room applauded. Patricia said several things about what the gift represented and what my history with the foundation had meant over the years. She used words like visionary, which made me uncomfortable, and steadfast, which felt closer to accurate. I looked at the audience once. Evelyn had gone completely still. She was staring at me the way you stare at something that doesn't compute. Not shocked exactly, more like a person who has been looking at a painting their whole life and suddenly noticed a figure in the background they'd completely missed. Richard had stopped mid-sentence in whatever he'd been saying to her. His mouth was still slightly open. I nodded at Patricia, said a few words about Gerald Hutchins and the men and women who'd taught me what real work looked like, and sat back down. I didn't look at Evelyn again for the rest of the program. Afterward, during the reception, I stood with Dennis and 2 other board members near the windows. Sandra brought me a club soda. We talked about the center's construction timeline, the community college partnership, logistics, normal conversation, the kind I'd been having for 11 years at these events. I felt Richard before I saw him. He appeared at my elbow, a little too close, a little too eager. Frank. His voice had changed. It was warmer than usual, fuller, the way voices get when someone has just revised their estimate of you upward. I didn't know you were involved with the foundation. For a while now, I said. He nodded several times, processing. Evelyn is... He paused. She'd love to say hello. I could see her from where I stood. She hadn't moved from the table. She was watching me across the room with an expression I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had broken a window with a baseball and was trying to decide whether to confess. Tell her I'll come find her in a few minutes, I said. She didn't wait. She was at my side inside of 30 seconds. Up close, the expression was more complicated. There was embarrassment in it. Pride, too, which surprised me. And underneath both of those, something quieter, something that looked almost like grief. Like she was mourning a version of a story she'd been telling herself for a long time. Dad. Her voice was low. Evelyn. She looked at the club soda in my hand. At Dennis, who politely excused himself. At the room, which was still full and loud and paying no attention to the 2 of us. Then back at me. How long? She said. How long? What? She spread her hand slightly, a gesture that meant all of it. Any of it. I thought about Gerald, about the rented garage, about Carol, who had been beside me for every single year of it, about the night I sat alone in my kitchen until midnight, thinking about a comment my daughter didn't even remember making. Long enough, I said. We didn't stay at the gala much longer. I said my goodbyes to the board, shook Patricia's hand, thanked Sandra. Evelyn and Richard walked with me to the parking garage. The three of us stood beside my truck in a way that felt like the beginning of a conversation none of us knew how to start. Finally, Richard said he'd get the car, and it was just the two of us. Evelyn stared at the concrete floor for a long moment. I called you a small landscaping business, she said quietly, to the man in the gray suit. Yes, she closed her eyes. Dad, it's all right. Quote, it's not, she looked up. I was embarrassed for people to know you were my father. I didn't think. She stopped, started again. I thought I knew exactly what you were. That sentence landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. I know, I said. She wiped the corner of her eye quickly, like she was hoping I wouldn't notice. Why didn't you ever say anything? I looked out at the line of parked cars. Thought about how to say the true thing without making it heavier than it needed to be. Because I wanted you to be proud of me without needing a reason, I said. And when I finally figured out you weren't, I didn't know how to change your mind without it feeling like I was just proving a point. And proving a point isn't the same as being your father. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, almost to herself, she said, Mom knew, didn't she? Your mother knew everything. Evelyn nodded slowly. And I watched something shift in her face. Not a sudden change. More like a slow settling, the way a house makes sounds when the temperature drops and the wood adjusts to something real. I need some time, she said. Take it, I said. I drove home alone. The highway was quiet. I thought about Carol the whole way. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that, because stories like mine sometimes get cleaned up in the telling. All the rough edges sanded down until everything shines like something it wasn't. The truth is that honesty, even necessary honesty, costs something. And what it cost me was 3 weeks of silence from my daughter and a lot of long evenings sitting on my back porch watching the oak tree lose its leaves. I didn't regret the gala. I didn't regret sitting at that board table or standing up when my name was called. But I also didn't feel triumphant. Triumph is a young man's emotion. What I felt was tired and a little relieved, and mostly just hopeful in a careful, don't press your luck kind of way. During those weeks, I did something I'd been putting off for 3 years. I started organizing Carol's things, the last of the boxes I hadn't been able to face. Photographs, cards she'd saved, a journal she'd kept the year before she got sick. I didn't read much of it. Mostly I just held it. That was enough. I also called Dennis and had one final conversation about the trust documents. Not to change anything, just to make sure I understood everything clearly, and to make sure Evelyn would too when the time came. The picture was straightforward. A significant portion would eventually fund the Workforce Center's scholarship endowment and expand the trades training program over the next decade. A portion would go to the community foundation Carol had quietly supported for years. What remained would be shared between Evelyn and the grandchildren she didn't have yet, structured in a way that required no performance, no gratitude, no strings, just care. Dennis asked if Evelyn knew about her share. I told him she'd find out when she was ready to hear it. She called on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after the gala. I was in the garage, reorganizing the tools I hadn't touched in 2 years, listening to a ball game on the radio. When I saw her name on the phone, I turned the radio down. Hi, sweetheart. A pause. Then, hi, Dad. Another pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, just full. I've been thinking about what you said, she told me, in the parking garage. About wanting me to be proud of you without needing a reason. Her voice was careful, deliberate. The voice she used in court, I imagined, when she was saying something that mattered. I want you to know that I heard that. And I've been sitting with how badly I got it wrong. Evelyn, let me finish. She took a breath. I spent 20 years building a version of success in my head. What it looked like. What it sounded like. What kind of people had it. A pause. And I put you in a category, Dad. Without asking. Without looking. I just decided what you were and stopped there. And that's not something I can explain away. I know that. I I sat down on the garage steps. I'm not asking you to explain it away, I said. I know. Her voice caught slightly. I'm asking if there's a way through it. I thought about Gerald Hutchins, who gave me more than he had to because he saw something in me worth betting on. I thought about Carol, who understood me completely and still chose to stay. I thought about 93 employees who showed up every morning because someone had built something worth showing up for. I thought about a little girl I used to take to the county fair every summer, who would eat 3 pieces of funnel cake and fall asleep in the truck on the way home. There's always a way through, I said. She came to Terre Haute the following Saturday. No, Richard, just her. She pulled into the driveway in her sensible Volvo, got out carrying 2 bags of groceries, and said she was going to cook dinner, which I knew was her way of doing something with her hands while we talked. We cooked together for an hour and a half. Pot roast, her mother's recipe, the one Carol had written on an index card that still lived in the second drawer of my kitchen. Evelyn found it herself. She didn't say anything when she read it. She just smoothed it flat on the counter and followed it carefully. We talked while we cooked, not about the trust, not about the business, not about the gala. About her mother. About the early years when the company was 2 men and a rented garage and nothing was guaranteed. About what Gerald taught me and what I tried to pass along. About the choices I made and the ones I got wrong. About the things I wished I'd said out loud instead of assuming she knew. At some point, she looked at me over the pot and said, "Why did you stay so quiet about all of it for so long?" I thought about the honest answer before I gave it, not the tidy version, the real one. Because I was afraid, I said. Not of being wrong about you, of being right. I looked at the kitchen window, at the backyard going dark outside. If you only respected me because of what I'd built, if the money was the thing that changed how you saw me, then it would have meant that the person I actually was had never been enough. And I didn't know how to live with that answer, so I put it off. For too long. Evelyn set down the spoon she was holding. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've known your whole life and are only just starting to see clearly. You were always enough, Dad, she said. I was just too busy being impressed by everything else to notice. We ate dinner at the same kitchen table where I'd sat alone too many evenings to count. We talked until almost 11 o'clock. We didn't fix everything. You don't fix 20 years of quiet misunderstanding over pot roast, no matter how good the recipe is. But we started. And sometimes the start is the whole thing. After she left, I stood on the front porch and watched her headlights disappear around the corner. The neighborhood was still. The oak tree had lost most of its leaves. The air had the smell of late October in Indiana, cold and a little like firewood. I thought about the question I'd been carrying for the past 2 months. Not the angry version, not the hurt version, but the real one. After everything, is this what I am to you? The answer, it turned out, was still being written. The hardest thing about a life like mine, a quiet life, a life spent building something nobody sees from the outside, is that you stop expecting people to look. You build the habit of invisibility so thoroughly that it starts to feel like safety. And then one day you're standing in a parking garage with your daughter, and you realize that invisible is just another word for lonely. I learned something over those months that I should have learned much earlier. The people who love you will still love you when the whole picture is visible. You don't have to protect them from the truth about who you are, and you don't have to protect yourself from the truth about who they are either. That's just what it means to actually know somebody. If you've spent years being underestimated by the people closest to you, you are not alone. I'd like to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step towards something better. Sometimes the quietest lives hold the deepest foundations. Frank never needed a spotlight. He needed his daughter to finally look. And when she did, she found not a small landscaping man, but someone who had spent decades building, giving, and loving without asking to be seen. The reminder for all of us is gentle but real. Don't wait for a gala to tell the people beside you that you see them. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment while quietly carrying a lesson worth keeping.